they ran the camps. They wielded whips, wielded power, and wielded a cruelty that survivors would describe for decades afterward with a combination of disbelief and terror. They were the female guards of the Nazi concentration camp system, known in German as Aufseherinnen, and their story is one of the most disturbing and in many ways most overlooked chapters of the Second World War. When the Allied armies swept across Germany and liberated the camps in the spring of 1945, they found evidence of atrocities that defied comprehension. And among those responsible were thousands of women who had chosen, voluntarily and often eagerly, to serve as enforcers of the Nazi killing machine. What happened to them after the war ended? Were they tried? Were they punished? Did they escape justice entirely? In this video, we are going to find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Before we get to the individuals, it helps to understand the system that created them. The first female guards were recruited by the SS in 1939, initially to staff the women's sections of camps like Lichtenberg and then Ravensbrück, which became the central female concentration camp of the Third Reich. Located north of Berlin in the state of Mecklenburg, Ravensbrück would eventually hold over 130,000 women from more than 30 countries. It was here that the Aufseherinnen were trained, processed, and dispatched across the camp network. By the war's end, approximately 3,500 women had served as SS guards in the concentration camp system, a number that historians have had to piece together from fragmentary records, trial transcripts, and survivor testimony. They came from ordinary backgrounds: factory workers, shop assistants, domestic servants, and farm labourers. The SS offered them better pay than civilian work, SS benefits, and a uniform that conferred immediate status and authority. Many were recruited by female relatives or friends already in the system. The training they received at Ravensbrück was limited but formative, and what it instilled above all else was a culture of contempt for prisoners, combined with the expectation that violence was not just permitted, but expected. What they did with that permission would define the darkest chapters of their lives, and in many cases, the rest of their lives, after 1945. Irma Grisi was 22 years old when the British hanged her at Hamelin Prison on December 13, 1945. She had been born on October 7, 1923, in the small German village of Rechen in Mecklenburg, the third of 5 children of a dairy farmer. Her childhood was unremarkable, except for a marked fascination with the Nazi youth movement, which she joined as a teenager. She left school at 14 and took a series of unskilled jobs before applying to work at Ravensbrück in 1942. She was 19 when she arrived and showed an almost immediate aptitude for cruelty that alarmed even some of her colleagues. Within months, she had been transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and deadliest killing centre in the Nazi Empire, where she rose to the rank of Lagerführerin, meaning camp compound leader, and became one of the most senior female SS personnel in the camp's history. Survivors described her as physically striking, blonde and tall, but the testimony about her behaviour was uniformly harrowing. She was said to have beaten prisoners with a plaited whip, to have sicked her trained dogs on inmates, to have arbitrarily selected women for the gas chambers, and to have derived visible pleasure from humiliating and brutalising those under her control. The exact number of deaths she was directly responsible for is impossible to calculate, but the scale of suffering she inflicted was documented by dozens of survivors in remarkable and consistent detail. In March 1945, Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, the camp in northern Germany that British forces liberated in April 1945. The conditions the British found there shocked a world that had thought itself beyond shock. Grese was arrested on the spot, standing among piles of corpses and barely living survivors in the camp's appalling final days. She was tried at the Belsen trial, formerly known as the trial of Joseph Kramer and 44 others, which convened at Lüneburg in September 1945. The British military tribunal heard evidence from survivor after survivor, each describing scenes of methodical sadism. Grese's defence was essentially that she had been following orders and that the worst accusations were exaggerated. The tribunal rejected this comprehensively. She was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. On the morning of December 13, 1945, she was executed by the British hangman Albert Pierrepoint, making her one of the youngest women ever to be executed by a Western government in the 20th century. She went to the scaffold without visible emotion, reportedly saying only the single word "schnell," meaning quickly, to the hangman. She was 22 years old, The question her case raised, which would echo through every subsequent female guard trial, was how someone so young could become capable of such extreme and deliberate cruelty. The answer, uncomfortable as it remains, is that the camp system created the conditions in which cruelty was normalized, rewarded, and eventually unremarkable. Elisabeth Falkenrath was hanged alongside Irma Griese on the same morning, December 13, 1945, and in many ways her trajectory illuminates the institutional nature of female guard violence even more clearly than Griese's individual sadism. Falkenrath had been born Elisabeth Mühlau on September 5, 1919, in Schönau an der Katzbach in Silesia, and had come from an equally ordinary background. She had worked in a hairdressing salon before being recruited to Ravensbrück in 1941. What distinguished Falkenrath was the speed and apparent enthusiasm with which she adapted to the camp environment and rose through its hierarchy. She transferred to Auschwitz in 1942 and eventually became Oberaufseherin, the chief female supervisor, meaning she held authority over all of the female guard staff in the camp. In that capacity, she was directly involved in the process of selection, that chilling word the Nazis used to describe the practice of choosing which prisoners would be sent immediately to the gas chambers on arrival. Survivors testified that Falkenrath participated in selections personally, indicating with a gesture which women and children would live and which would die. She was also accused of beating prisoners to death on multiple occasions and of ordering the execution of inmates who had attempted to escape. Like Griese, she was captured at Bergen-Belsen and tried at the Belsen trial. The tribunal found her guilty and sentenced her to death. She was executed alongside Griese and a third female guard, Juana Bormann, making December 13, 1945 the day on which 3 women were hanged by the British for concentration camp crimes, an event without precedent in British legal history. Falkenrath was 26 years old at the time of her execution. Her case is particularly significant because her role as Oberaufseherin meant she bore institutional as well as individual responsibility for the regime of violence at Auschwitz. She was not merely a guard who committed acts of personal sadism. She was an administrator of that sadism, someone who organized and oversaw a system of female guard violence on an industrial scale. Juana Bormann, the third woman executed at Hamelin that December morning, had a reputation among Belsen survivors that was, if anything, even more terrifying than those of Griese and Falkenrath. She was born on February 10, 1893 in Birkenfelde in East Prussia, which made her 52 years old at the time of her execution, the oldest of the 3 women hanged that day. She had worked as a domestic servant for most of her adult life before joining the female guard service in 1938. Making her one of the earliest recruits to the Ravensbrück system. She served at a number of camps over the following years, including Ravensbrück itself, Auschwitz, and eventually Belsen. What survivors remembered most vividly about Bormann was her dog, a large Alsatian that she used as a weapon of terror, setting it deliberately on prisoners and watching as it tore them apart. Witnesses testified to multiple specific incidents in which Bormann directed her dog to attack individuals who had done nothing to provoke her, apparently for her own entertainment. Several of these attacks resulted in deaths. She was also accused of beating prisoners herself and of selecting women for the gas chambers. At her trial, Bormann claimed that she had been kind to prisoners and that the accusations against her were false. The survivors who testified against her told a very different story, with a level of consistent and corroborated detail that left the tribunal in no doubt. She was convicted and sentenced to death. Executed on December 13, 1945, she remains one of the few women ever put to death by the British government for war crimes. The image of Bormann with her dog became, in the years after the war, one of the defining symbols of female guard violence, a reminder that the cruelty of the Aufseherinnen was not limited to the young or the fanatical, but had drawn in women of every age and background. Dorothea Binz was perhaps the most feared of all the Ravensbrück guards, and her name appears more consistently in the testimony of camp survivors than almost any other. She was born on March 16, 1920, in Duisterbeck in Mecklenburg, and began working at Ravensbrück in 1939, just as the camp was becoming operational. Unlike many of the Aufseherinnen who came from elsewhere and were assigned to Ravensbrück for training, Binz built her entire career there, rising from junior guard to Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor, making her one of the most powerful women in the camp hierarchy. Her tenure at Ravensbrück spanned almost the entire war, and the testimony about her behavior during that period is extensive and deeply disturbing. Survivors described her as extraordinarily violent, taking particular pleasure in beating prisoners in the punishment block, the camp's dedicated torture facility where inmates were subjected to flogging on the orders of the camp commandant. Binz was said to have not merely supervised these punishments but to have administered them personally and enthusiastically, reportedly enjoying the process. She was also accused of participating in the selection of prisoners for medical experiments, the program of hideous pseudo-scientific procedures conducted at Ravensbrück that left hundreds of women permanently disfigured or disabled. Among the prisoners subjected to these experiments were a group of Polish women who became known after the war as the Ravensbrück Rabbits, a name they chose in grim acknowledgement of the way they had been treated as laboratory animals. Several of these women survived to testify at post-war trials. Binz was arrested after the war and tried at the Ravensbrück trial, a British military tribunal held at Hamburg in 1946 and 1947. The evidence against her was overwhelming, drawn from the testimony of dozens of survivors and corroborated by documentary records. She was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binz was executed at Hamelin Prison by Albert Pierrepoint, the same hangman who had executed Grace and Volkenrath 16 months earlier. She was 27 years old. In the history of the Ravensbrück system, Binz stands as the clearest example of someone who did not simply adapt to the culture of violence she found in the camp, but actively drove and intensified it, using her position to pursue a personal campaign of sadism that went well beyond what even the SS expected of its female personnel. Maria Mandl was one of the most senior female SS officers in the entire concentration camp system, and her eventual fate, after a post-war career as a fugitive, raises important questions about how seriously different Allied powers took the prosecution of female camp personnel. Mandl was born on January 10, 1912, in Münzkirchen in Austria and came from a working-class Catholic family. She joined the SS Female Guard Service in 1938 and served at Lichtenberg, the early women's camp, before moving to Ravensbrück. In 1942, she was appointed Lagerführerin, camp leader of the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, making her the highest-ranking female SS official at the largest killing centre in the history of the world. She held this position until late 1944, overseeing a regime of systematic murder on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Under her authority, hundreds of thousands of Jewish women and children were selected for immediate gassing upon arrival. Mandl participated personally in selections, and survivor testimony describes her walking along the lines of newly arrived deportees and indicating with calm efficiency which women would be sent left to the gas chambers and which would be spared for slave labour. She was known inside the camp as Die Beastie, meaning the beast, a name that conveys something of the terror she inspired. There was, paradoxically, one element of her character that several survivors mentioned in their testimony: an apparent love of music. Mandl reportedly established a women's orchestra at Auschwitz-Birkenau that played at the camp gate as prisoner work details marched out and returned, and she was said to have listened to their performances with evident pleasure. The orchestra's existence saved the lives of its members, who were not subjected to the same lethal labour regimes as other prisoners, but this apparent flicker of aesthetic sensibility existed alongside, and did nothing to mitigate a career of mass murder. In November 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east, Mandl was transferred to the Mühldorf subcamp of Dachau in Bavaria. She was captured by American forces in May 1945 in the Austrian mountains, where she had gone into hiding. Rather than being tried by an American tribunal, she was extradited to Poland, where the crimes she had committed against Polish citizens at Auschwitz gave the Polish government a compelling legal and moral claim to jurisdiction. She was tried in Krakow in November and December 1947 before a Polish court. The evidence presented was devastating, drawing on the testimony of Auschwitz survivors and the documentary records that had been captured when the camp was liberated by Soviet forces in January 1945. Mandl was found guilty of crimes against the Polish nation and sentenced to death. She was executed by hanging in Krakow on January 24, 1948. She was 35 years old. Her case set an important precedent for the extradition of Nazi war criminals to the countries where their crimes had been committed, a principle that would shape the prosecution of Nazi perpetrators for decades to come. Ruth Closius-Neudeck was one of those Ravensbrück guards who might have escaped prosecution entirely had it not been for the persistence of survivors who identified her by name in their testimony. She had been born Ruth Closius on July 2, 1920 in Ragnit, in East Prussia, and had joined the Female Guard Service in 1943, relatively late in the war. She served at Ravensbrück and was present during the camp's most murderous final phase, the period from late 1944 through April 1945, when thousands of prisoners were killed in a frantic attempt to destroy evidence before the Allied armies arrived. The methods used during this period included mass shootings, lethal injections administered in the camp's infirmary, and the systematic destruction of records. Closius participated in the violence of this period and was specifically accused of involvement in the killing of prisoners by injection. After the war, she had attempted to reintegrate into civilian life under her married name Neudeck, but was identified by former prisoners and arrested by British authorities. She was tried at the Ravensbrück trial in Hamburg, where the evidence against her, while less dramatic than that presented against Binz or Mandel, was sufficient to secure a conviction. She was sentenced to death and executed at Hamelin Prison on May 3, 1947, the day after Dorothea Binz. What her case illustrates is the degree to which even relatively junior female guards could become deeply implicated in mass murder, particularly during the desperate final months of the camp system when the distinction between guard and killer had effectively dissolved. Herta Botha presents one of the more unsettling case studies in the history of female SS guard prosecution because she was tried, convicted, and then released relatively quickly, going on to live for decades in post-war Germany in what appears to have been quiet obscurity. Botha was born on January 8, 1921 in Teterow in Mecklenburg and joined the Female Guard Service in 1942. She served at Ravensbrück, then at the Stutthof camp near Danzig on the Baltic coast, and finally at Beindorf in northern Germany before arriving at Bergen-Belsen in early 1945. Her time at Stutthof was particularly significant, as this was a camp where conditions were brutal even by the standards of the concentration camp system, and where female guards played a central role in maintaining a regime of violence that killed thousands of prisoners through starvation, exposure, and deliberate murder. At Belsen, Botha was present during the catastrophic final weeks before liberation, when disease and starvation killed prisoners at a rate of hundreds per day, and the dead lay unburied across the campgrounds. British forces found her there and arrested her along with dozens of other guards and camp personnel. She was tried at the Belsen trial in September 1945. The prosecution presented evidence of her involvement in beatings at Stutthof and Belsen, and survivor testimony described her using a stick to beat prisoners. During her trial, Botha made a statement that became one of the most quoted remarks to emerge from the entire series of Belsen proceedings. Asked whether she was sorry for what she had done, she replied, "I made a mistake at Stutthof, but I don't know what mistake." The response seemed to capture something essential about the moral vacancy that the camp system had produced in its personnel, an inability to register the enormity of what they had done or to understand why others might find it objectionable. She was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Released in 1951 after serving only part of her sentence, Botha returned to civilian life in West Germany. She married and lived quietly, refusing for decades to discuss her past. She gave one interview late in life to a documentary filmmaker in which she expressed no remorse and seemed genuinely unable to understand why the world regarded her as a criminal. She died in 2000 at the age of 79, having outlived most of the survivors whose suffering she had contributed to. Hildegard Lechert was known inside Ravensbrück and Majdanek as Bloody Brigitte, a nickname earned through a career of personal violence so extensive and so consistently documented that it became something of a byword for female guard brutality in post-war German legal circles. She was born on November 20th, 1920 in Berlin, and joined the Female Guard Service in 1942. After initial service at Ravensbrück, she was transferred to Majdanek, the killing centre near Lublin in German-occupied Poland, and it was there that her reputation was established, and where the worst crimes attributed to her took place. Majdanek was one of the more unusual camps in the Nazi system in that it combined the functions of a concentration camp with those of an extermination centre, using both gas chambers and conventional camp conditions to kill its prisoners. The female guards at Majdanek were directly involved in the selection process and in the day-to-day violence that killed thousands of prisoners through beatings, shootings, and deliberate starvation. Lechert was accused of participating in all of these activities. Survivors described her with particular vividness, recalling a woman who seemed to seek out opportunities for violence, who beat prisoners in the face, who used her boots to kick those who had fallen, and who seemed entirely indifferent to the suffering she caused. After the war, she was arrested and tried by a Polish court, receiving a prison sentence. She was released, however, and returned to West Germany, where she was not immediately subjected to further prosecution. The German legal system's handling of Lechert in the post-war decades is one of the more troubling aspects of her case. She was identified and investigated multiple times by German prosecutors, but proceedings were delayed and complicated by bureaucratic obstacles and by the broader reluctance of West German society to confront the crimes of its own citizens. It was not until 1975 that she stood trial in West Germany as part of the Majdanek trial in Düsseldorf, one of the longest and most complex war crimes prosecutions in German legal history. The trial lasted from 1975 to 1981, an extraordinary 6 years of proceedings involving 17 defendants. Lechert was convicted of aiding and abetting murder in 1981 and sentenced to 12 years in prison. She died in 1995, having served her sentence. What her story illustrates more than almost any other is the decades-long gap between the crimes committed and the eventual reckoning, a gap that allowed many perpetrators to live relatively comfortable lives in post-war Germany while their victims, or the families of their victims, waited for justice that often arrived late, if at all. Grete Büsel was one of the most senior administrative figures among the female SS Guard personnel, and her post-war fate intersects with the complicated question of how institutional responsibility for camp violence was assessed and prosecuted. Born in 1908, Büsel rose to become one of the chief Aufseherinnen, overseeing the deployment of female guards across the camp network, essentially serving as a personnel manager for the system of female guard violence that the SS had constructed. In this role, she made decisions about which guards would be posted where, which women would be promoted, and how the workforce of female camp personnel would be organized and maintained. After the war, she was tried at the Ravensbrück trial and convicted, receiving a death sentence. She was executed at Hamelin Prison in 1947. Her case raises a question that runs through every female guard prosecution, namely the question of what form responsibility takes when it is exercised through administration, rather than direct physical violence. Büsel had not, as far as the evidence showed, beaten prisoners to death with her own hands. What she had done was help build and maintain a system in which thousands of other women did exactly that. The tribunal's decision to hold her to the same standard as those who had committed direct violence represented an important statement about the nature of institutional complicity, a principle that would be articulated more fully in subsequent war crimes prosecutions. But that was already implicit in the Ravensbrück verdicts. Carmen Mori was a Swiss citizen, and her presence among the accused at the Ravensbrück trial gave the proceedings an international dimension that was unusual in the context of post-war war crimes justice. Mori had been born in 1906 in Berlin to a Swiss father and a German mother, and had lived a somewhat peripatetic life before the war as a journalist, and by some accounts, an agent of German intelligence. She ended up in Ravensbrück as a prisoner herself, having been arrested on espionage charges, but her status as a prisoner did not prevent her from collaborating with the SS administration in ways that made her directly complicit in the murder of other prisoners. She became a Blockeltester, a prisoner functionary responsible for maintaining order in a block, and in this capacity she was accused of denouncing fellow prisoners to the SS, of physically assaulting women under her charge, and of directly participating in the killing of sick prisoners in the infirmary. The use of prisoner functionaries was a deliberate element of the Nazi camp system's design, intended to diffuse responsibility for violence and to create a layer of perpetrators who were themselves prisoners and therefore potentially less straightforward to prosecute. In Mori's case, the British tribunal was unimpressed by this argument. She was convicted and sentenced to death. She died in her cell in Hamburg before the sentence could be carried out, killing herself in April 1947. Her case illustrates the morally complex terrain of prisoner complicity that post-war trials had to navigate. The question of how to assess the culpability of those who committed crimes under conditions of extreme coercion and threat, while simultaneously enjoying privileges denied to other prisoners. Johanna Langerfeld occupied a unique position in the history of the female guard service because she was simultaneously one of its most senior figures and someone who appears to have had at least some reservations about the direction the system was taking. Born on March 4, 1900, in Kupferdreh near Essen, Langerfeld joined the guard service early, working at Lichtenberg before Ravensbrück opened in 1939. She became the first Oberaufseherin of Ravensbrück, which meant she was in effect the founding commander of the female guard program at the camp that would train virtually every female SS guard in the system. She later served at Auschwitz as Lagerführerin of the women's camp, a position she held for a period in 1942, before being replaced by Maria Mandl. Reports from the period suggest that Langerfeld had conflicts with male SS officers over the treatment of prisoners, not out of any principled humanitarian concern, but apparently due to a belief that the system would function more effectively with less overt chaos. She was arrested by the SS itself at one point on suspicion of complicity with Polish prisoners, a charge that speaks to the complicated politics of the camp administration. After the war, she was captured and held by Polish authorities who wanted to try her for her crimes at Auschwitz. She escaped from Polish custody in 1946 in circumstances that remain somewhat obscure, possibly with assistance from West German officials or Catholic Church contacts. She lived under an assumed name in Bavaria for years before being identified. Legal proceedings against her in West Germany were repeatedly delayed and ultimately abandoned when she was deemed unfit for trial on health grounds. She died in 1974 in Augsburg, having never faced formal judicial proceedings for her role in establishing and running one of the most murderous institutions in human history. Her case became a symbol of the failures of both Polish and West German justice to hold senior female SS personnel accountable. Erna Petry was not an Aufseherin in the formal sense. She was the wife of an SS officer stationed in occupied Poland, and her case, which came to light only through East German investigations in the 1960s, reveals a dimension of female participation in Nazi atrocities that extends well beyond the formal guard service. Born in 1920 in Schkölen in Thuringia, she had married an SS agricultural administrator named Horst Petry and accompanied him to the family's requisitioned estate in the occupied Soviet Union near Lvov. In 1943, returning to the estate from a shopping trip, she discovered 6 Jewish children hiding near the road, children who had apparently escaped from a deportation convoy and were huddled in the woods, starving and barely able to stand. She took them back to the estate, fed them, and then led them one by one into the forest and shot each of them in the back of the neck. She later told East German investigators that she had acted to prove to her husband and to herself that she could be as hard and as committed as any male SS man. She was tried in East Germany in 1961 and convicted of murder, receiving a life sentence that was later reduced. Her case, which received relatively little attention in the West at the time, has since become one of the most studied examples of what historians have called the female perpetrator question, the challenge of understanding how women who were not products of the military culture, the hierarchical SS discipline, or the specific psychology of the camp guard could nonetheless commit acts of direct and personal killing. Petry's crime was not the result of orders, or of a culture of impunity, or of the specific pressures of the camp environment. It was a voluntary act committed in the open countryside with a woman who had, in some sense, chosen to inhabit the moral universe of the perpetrators as fully as possible. The legal landscape into which the female guard trials were placed was one of improvisation and contested precedent. The Nuremberg tribunals that tried the senior Nazi leadership in 1945 and 1946 established a framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity and war crimes, but the vast majority of concentration camp personnel, both male and female, were tried not at Nuremberg but at a series of smaller military tribunals organised by the individual Allied powers and at domestic courts in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and later West Germany. For female guards specifically, this fragmentation had profound consequences. A guard who had served at multiple camps might find herself subject to the jurisdiction of different powers, each with its own prosecutorial priorities, its own evidentiary standards, and its own political pressures. Some faced multiple trials. Others slipped through the cracks entirely, prosecuted in one jurisdiction but not in another, or identified by survivors but never successfully brought to court. Understanding the fates of the Aufseherinnen requires understanding not just what they did, but how the machinery of post-war justice worked and how frequently it failed. Louise Dans survived the war, avoided immediate prosecution, and eventually stood trial in Poland, decades after the events for which she was charged, a trajectory that illustrates the extraordinary legal odyssey that post-war justice sometimes required. She was born on December 11, 1917, in Waldorf in Baden, and joined the Female Guard Service in 1943. She served at a series of camps including Ravensbrück, Plaszow, Auschwitz, and Malchow, before ending up at Lübeck at the war's end. Her record was one of consistent and documented violence, with survivor testimony from multiple camps describing beatings, arbitrary punishments, and in at least one case an incident in which she was accused of directly participating in the murder of a prisoner. After the war, she was arrested by British forces and transferred to Polish custody, where she was tried in 1947 in the trial of Armin Goeth and others, the proceedings that dealt with crimes committed at the Plaszow camp near Krakow, the camp later made famous in the film Schindler's List. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, she was released from Polish custody in 1956 under the terms of a general amnesty that applied to a number of German nationals still held in Polish prisons. She returned to West Germany and resumed civilian life. For years, she lived in Bavaria, identified but not prosecuted by West German authorities. It was not until 1996 that German prosecutors finally brought charges against her in connection with murders committed at the Malchow subcamp of Ravensbrück. She was then 78 years old. The proceedings were ultimately suspended due to her advanced age and deteriorating health. She died in 2009 at the age of 91, having spent the last 50 years of her life in West Germany without serving any further sentence for her crimes. Her case is one of the more egregious examples of the failure of West German justice to pursue former female camp personnel with the same rigour applied to some of their male counterparts. Vera Salvaquart occupies a distinctive and singularly chilling place in the history of Ravensbrück, because the crimes attributed to her were not those of a guard in the conventional sense, but of a medical killer. Born in 1919 in Bohemia, Salvaquart had worked as a nurse before being imprisoned at Ravensbrück herself, then, like Carmen Mori, becoming a prisoner functionary whose privileges within the camp came at a terrible price. She worked in the camp's infirmary and was accused of administering lethal injections to sick prisoners, acting in effect as the execution arm of the camp's systematic program of murdering those who were too ill to work. Witness testimony described her preparing powders that she mixed into patients' food, telling them it was medicine, while the substance was, in fact, a killing agent. The number of prisoners killed in this way was difficult to establish precisely, but testimony suggested it ran into the dozens, if not hundreds. She was tried at the Ravensbrück trial and, despite claiming that she herself had been a prisoner and had acted under compulsion, was convicted and sentenced to death. She was executed at Hamelin prison in June 1946. Her case raises the same uncomfortable question as Carmen Mori's, the question of what moral and legal weight should be given to coercion when the defendant was not a free person, but a prisoner operating under the constant threat of their own death. The tribunal's answer was unambiguous. The murders she had committed were murders regardless of the circumstances under which she had committed them, and the death sentence reflected a judgment that the degree of personal agency she had exercised was sufficient to hold her fully accountable. Emma Zimmer was one of the oldest of the Aufseherinnen to face justice after the war, and her case involves a prison camp for women in Germany itself, rather than the more distant killing centres of the occupied East, which gave her post-war prosecution a slightly different character. Born in 1888, she was 51 years old when she joined the Female Guard Service in 1939 and served at Ravensbrück throughout the war. Her age and seniority gave her a particular standing among the female personnel, and she was reportedly one of the most feared guards in the camp, known for a systematic cruelty that had nothing of Greece's youth or volatility, but instead the cold and deliberate quality of someone who had fully internalized the camp's values over many years of service. Survivors described her administering beatings with a calculated precision that was in some ways more disturbing than the more impulsive violence of younger guards. She was tried at the Ravensbrück trial and convicted. The tribunal sentenced her to life imprisonment, a judgment that reflected both the severity of her crimes and presumably some recognition of her age. She died in British custody in 1948, serving her sentence in Hamelin prison. The story of Ilse Koch is perhaps the most notorious among all the female guard cases, and the circumstances of her prosecution and the controversies that surrounded it made her one of the most discussed Nazi perpetrators of the post-war period. Koch was born, Ilse Köhler, on September 22, 1906, in Dresden, and had worked as a secretary before meeting and marrying Karl Otto Koch, who would become the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. As the commandant's wife, Ilse Koch occupied a quasi-official position at Buchenwald that gave her access to the camp and its prisoners while also providing her with a kind of informal immunity from the chain of command that governed the guards. She was not an Aufseherin in the technical sense, as Buchenwald was not primarily a women's camp, but she exercised power over prisoners in ways that went well beyond anything her formal status would have authorized. The allegations against Koch were exceptionally grave, and in some cases unique in the annals of Nazi atrocity. Survivors accused her of riding through the camp on horseback and selecting prisoners who caught her attention for punishment or worse. Most infamously, she was accused of collecting items made from the tattooed skin of murdered prisoners, an allegation that, when it emerged at her American military trial in 1947, shocked even a public that had grown accustomed to revelations of Nazi horror. The case of the human skin items became one of the most debated forensic questions of the early post-war period. American investigators found items at Buchenwald that appeared to be made from human skin, and several medical experts testified that this was indeed the case. Koch was tried by an American military tribunal at Dachau in 1947 and convicted, receiving a life sentence. However, in a decision that caused enormous controversy, the American military governor General Lucius Clay reviewed her sentence in 1948 and reduced it to 4 years, concluding that the evidence of her personal guilt was insufficient to sustain a life sentence. She was released in 1949. The outcry in the United States, where congressional hearings were held to examine the decision, was intense. Koch was subsequently arrested by West German authorities and tried again in a domestic court, this time in Augsburg. The West German proceedings, which concluded in 1951, resulted in a life sentence that was upheld on appeal. She served the remainder of that sentence in Aichach prison in Bavaria, where she died on September 1, 1967, having hanged herself in her cell. She was 60 years old. The controversy over Clay's original decision to reduce her sentence and the subsequent need for a second trial by a West German court to impose an adequate punishment encapsulates many of the tensions that ran through post-war war crimes justice, tensions between different Allied powers, different evidentiary standards, and different political pressures, all operating in the shadow of crimes that defied any established legal framework. Anna Klein-Plaubel served at Ravensbrück and was among the group of guards who managed to avoid the immediate post-war trials while still being subject to eventual German prosecution. Her case exemplifies the grinding slowness of the West German legal process when it came to former female camp personnel. Born in 1906, she had served in the final period of Ravensbrück's operation and was present during the deadly spring of 1945 when the camp's administrators were attempting both to kill as many prisoners as possible and to destroy the evidence of what they had done. She was identified by survivors but managed to avoid arrest in the immediate post-war chaos. West German prosecutors investigated her case over a number of years before eventually bringing proceedings that were ultimately abandoned due to legal technicalities and the reluctance of the German judicial system to pursue cases that had grown old and complicated. Her fate illustrates a pattern that recurred throughout the West German prosecution of former Aufseherinnen. The combination of investigative delays, evidentiary challenges, and institutional reluctance that allowed many perpetrators to live out their lives without facing legal consequences. Hildegard Neumann was among the more senior administrative figures in the Auschwitz women's camp, serving under Maria Mandl and exercising significant authority over the daily lives and deaths of prisoners. Born in 1919 in the Sudetenland, she had joined the Female Guard Service in 1942 and demonstrated a rapid aptitude for the administrative work of the camp that saw her rise quickly. She was involved in the selection process, the registration of new arrivals, and the administration of a camp where the normal vocabulary of bureaucracy coexisted with the machinery of mass murder in ways that would later seem to defy comprehension. After the war, she returned to the Sudetenland, which had by then become part of Czechoslovakia, and was arrested by Czech authorities. She was tried in Czechoslovakia in the late 1940s and convicted, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment. She was eventually released and returned to West Germany, where she lived until her death. Her case illustrates the role that Czechoslovak and other Eastern European judicial systems played in prosecuting female camp personnel, a contribution to post-war justice that is sometimes overshadowed by the more prominent American, British, and Polish trials. What did the trials of the Aufseherinnen collectively reveal about the nature of female participation in Nazi atrocities? This is a question that historians and legal scholars have grappled with for decades, and that admits of no simple answer. The defendants came from different backgrounds, served at different camps, committed different types of crimes, and faced different legal systems with very different outcomes. But certain patterns emerge. The first is that the recruitment and training system for female guards actively selected for, or at least failed to screen against, a capacity for violence that it then cultivated and rewarded. Women who showed a willingness to use force were promoted. Women who expressed reluctance were marginalized or transferred. The system created powerful incentives to conform to a culture of brutality. The second pattern is that the immediate post-war trials, particularly those conducted by British military tribunals, were in many ways more thorough and more just than the subsequent proceedings in West Germany, where political pressures, legal obstacles, and the passage of time conspired to produce outcomes that fell far short of proportionate justice. The third pattern, and perhaps the most disturbing, is the sheer ordinariness of the perpetrators. With a few exceptions, the women who served as concentration camp guards were not psychopaths in any clinical sense. They were people who, placed in a specific institutional environment with specific incentives and specific pressures, became capable of things that would have been unimaginable to them in any other context. Emmy Göring represents yet another variation on the female guard story, one in which the perpetrator managed to conceal her past so effectively that she spent years in post-war Germany before being identified. Born in 1902, she had served at Ravensbrück and was accused of multiple acts of violence against prisoners, including beatings and involvement in the killing of sick inmates. After the war, she adopted a false identity and lived under a different name in West Germany for a number of years. She was eventually identified by a former prisoner who recognized her, and West German authorities opened an investigation. The investigation revealed the difficulty of prosecuting a case in which the primary evidence consisted of survivor testimony, given years or decades after the events, with defendants who denied everything and documentary records that were fragmentary or had been deliberately destroyed. In Hanke's case, as in many others, the proceedings ultimately failed to result in a conviction, not because the tribunal doubted the truth of what survivors had described, but because the evidentiary standard required for a criminal conviction in a domestic court was not met by evidence that would have been perfectly adequate for a military tribunal operating in 1945. The gap between what was morally certain and what was legally provable became one of the defining tragedies of the West German reckoning with its own perpetrators. Hermine Braunsteiner was, in terms of the trajectory of her post-war life, one of the most extraordinary cases among all the former Aufseherinnen. She managed not merely to avoid prosecution for decades, but to emigrate to the United States, become an American citizen, marry an American man, and live as an apparently ordinary housewife in Queens, New York, before being identified and ultimately becoming the first person ever extradited from the United States to face war crimes charges in West Germany. Born on July 16, 1919 in Vienna, Braunsteiner had joined the Female Guard Service in 1939 and served first at Ravensbrück before being posted to Majdanek, the camp outside Lublin, where she would earn a reputation for violence so extreme that her nickname among prisoners was Bloody Brigitte. The same nickname later applied to Hildegard Lechert, suggesting how deeply her reputation had penetrated the memory of Majdanek survivors. At Majdanek, she was specifically accused of personally participating in the selection of women and children for the gas chambers, of stamping prisoners to death with her hobnailed boots, and of whipping prisoners with such force and frequency that she became one of the defining symbols of female guard cruelty in that camp. She was also accused of seizing children by their hair and throwing them onto trucks destined for the gas chambers. After the war, she was arrested by Austrian authorities and tried in Vienna in 1949, where she was convicted of assaulting prisoners and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Having served this sentence, she was released and emigrated to Canada and subsequently to the United States, where she settled in Queens and married a construction worker named Russell Ryan in 1958. She became a naturalized American citizen in 1963. For years, she lived the life of a suburban housewife, apparently unremarkable to her neighbors. The breakthrough came in 1964 when Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal identified her during his investigations and passed her name to the New York Times journalist Joseph Lelyveld, who tracked her down to her home in Maspeth, Queens. When Lelyveld knocked on her door and asked if she was Hermine Braunsteiner, she reportedly confirmed her identity without hesitation. The subsequent story was a sensation in both the United States and Germany. American authorities began proceedings to denaturalize her, arguing that she had obtained American citizenship fraudulently by concealing her wartime record. This process took years, entangled in legal challenges and appeals, but was ultimately successful. In 1973, she was stripped of her American citizenship, the first such denaturalization on war crimes grounds in American history. She was extradited to West Germany in August 1973, making her the first person ever extradited from the United States to face war crimes charges, another legal first that her case established. She was tried in Düsseldorf as part of the Majdanek trial, the same massive and protracted proceedings in which Hildegard Lechert was also tried. The trial lasted from 1975 to 1981. Braunsteiner was convicted of joint murder in 300 cases and of complicity in the murder of 1,000 other people, receiving a life sentence. She served part of that sentence before being released in 1996 on compassionate grounds due to severe diabetes. She died in Bochum in 1999. Her case remains one of the most dramatic in the post-war history of Nazi war crimes prosecution, a story that encompasses Vienna, Queens, and Düsseldorf, and that established precedents for American extradition law that would apply in subsequent decades to other Nazi perpetrators. Irmgard Huber served as chief nurse at the Hadamar Psychiatric Institution in the Hesse region of Germany, which was not a concentration camp in the conventional sense, but was one of the key sites of the Nazi euthanasia program, known by its codename Action T4. The T4 program, which ran from 1939 to 1941 and then continued in modified form until 1945, involved the systematic murder of disabled, mentally ill, and otherwise institutionalized individuals whom the Nazi regime deemed unworthy of life. Hadamar killed over 10,000 people in its gas chambers and later through lethal injections and deliberate starvation. Huber's role in the institution gave her direct involvement in a program of mass murder that preceded and in many ways anticipated the techniques later deployed in the concentration camp system. She was tried by an American military tribunal at the Hadamar trial in October 1945, one of the earliest war crimes trials conducted by American forces. The tribunal was specifically concerned with the murder of Polish and Soviet forced laborers who had been killed at Hadamar after being transferred there from labor camps where they had contracted tuberculosis, a revelation that technically brought Hadamar's crimes within the framework of the laws of war rather than simply domestic murder. Huber was convicted and sentenced to 35 years imprisonment, later reduced. She served part of her sentence and was eventually released. Her case is significant not because of its outcome, but because of what the Hadamar trial represented in the broader history of post-war justice, one of the earliest legal confrontations with the T4 program, and an early attempt to grapple with the question of medical killing and professional complicity in genocide. Ruth Elfriede Hildner was among the female guards at Ravensbrück whose specific crimes involved the systematic torture of prisoners in the punishment block, the Strafblock, which was the camp's dedicated facility for inflicting what the SS euphemistically described as enhanced punishments. The Strafblock was a place where prisoners were subjected to flogging, solitary confinement, starvation rations, and extended standing punishments, and where the female guards who worked there were expected to administer or supervise these treatments with efficiency and without sentiment. Hildner was identified by survivors as having gone beyond the already brutal requirements of her role, reportedly administering beatings that went far beyond what the formal punishment system prescribed and engaging in casual violence against prisoners who had committed no infraction at all. After the war, she was arrested and tried in the British zone. Her case was one of many that illustrated the logistical challenge facing prosecutors trying to bring charges against former camp personnel when the surviving records were fragmentary. Many witnesses had died, and the defendants denied everything. She was convicted and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Her subsequent fate after release is not well documented, reflecting the more general problem that the post-war histories of many former female guards are extremely difficult to trace once they returned to civilian life. Eugenia von Skenner occupied a particular position in the history of the Ravensbrück trials because she was one of the defendants who managed to raise a more credible claim of limited personal agency than most of her co-defendants. A former prisoner who had become a block senior, she argued that her choices had been made under conditions of constant threat, that refusing to comply with SS demands would have resulted in her own death, and that she had in fact protected prisoners where she could while maintaining the minimum compliance necessary to survive. The tribunal found this argument partially credible in her case, distinguishing her situation from that of guards who had voluntarily joined the service, and the outcome of her case reflected a nuanced attempt to weigh the competing moral claims of coercion and complicity. She was convicted, but received a lesser sentence than the women tried alongside her, a distinction that illustrated the degree to which the British tribunals were willing to engage with the moral complexity of the prisoner functionary question, rather than treating all defendants as equivalent regardless of their circumstances. What was daily life actually like for the Aufseherinnen inside the camps? This is a question that historians have found surprisingly difficult to answer, partly because the post-war accounts of the guards themselves tended to minimize or deny their activities, and partly because the testimony of survivors, while vivid and credible on specific incidents of violence, naturally reflects the prisoner's perspective rather than that of the guards. What can be reconstructed from a combination of sources suggests that the female guards lived in conditions of relative comfort compared to the prisoners, with their own quarters, mess facilities, and recreational amenities, and that the social world of the camp created its own internal hierarchies and relationships among the guard personnel. They went to dances at the SS barracks. They formed friendships and sometimes romantic relationships with male SS personnel. They competed for promotion and better assignments. In some cases, they maintained contact with family members outside the camp through letters and visits. The mundane social world they inhabited coexisted with the machinery of mass murder in ways that seem almost incomprehensible from the outside, but that apparently struck many of the guards themselves as entirely normal. This normalization, the way in which the extraordinary became ordinary through prolonged exposure, is one of the most troubling aspects of the female guard phenomenon, and one of the most important things to understand about how atrocity becomes routine. Martha Gerse, not to be confused with Irma Gresse, despite the similar name, was a Ravensbrück guard whose post-war case illustrates the patchwork nature of denazification proceedings in the British and American zones. Born in 1893, she was one of the older generation of female guards whose service predated the war and who had helped establish the culture of the camp in its early years. She was identified and investigated by British authorities, but the proceedings against her were complicated by jurisdictional issues and by the competing demands on the limited resources that the Allied legal apparatus could devote to the prosecution of mid-level camp personnel. Her case was ultimately handled through denazification proceedings rather than formal war crimes prosecution, and the outcome reflected the much lower evidentiary standards and much lower penalties that the denazification system applied. She was classified as a lesser offender and subject to fines and employment restrictions rather than imprisonment, an outcome that survivors found deeply inadequate and that illustrates the enormous gap between what the formal war crimes trials achieved and what the broader denazification process delivered. The question of what the surviving Aufseherinnen told their families and communities about their wartime activities is one that recent German social history has begun to address more directly. Research conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, based on interviews with the children and grandchildren of former female guards, suggests that the most common response was silence. The women who returned to civilian life in West Germany after the war rarely spoke about what they had done, and in many cases their families were unaware of the nature of their wartime service until long after their deaths, when documents emerged or researchers made contact. A few of the women who had served shorter sentences and avoided the more serious charges managed to construct narratives that emphasized their subordinate status, their lack of choices, and the coercive environment of the camp system in ways that were partial truths at best and outright fabrications at worst. These narratives were sometimes accepted by families, neighbors, and communities that had their own reasons for not asking too many questions about the wartime past. The silence that surrounded the female guards in post-war Germany was part of the broader silence about perpetrators that West German society maintained for decades. A silence that only began to break down in the 1960s with the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt and the generational confrontation with the Nazi past that followed. Anneliese Kohlmann was arrested in 1945 and tried before a British military tribunal as part of one of the smaller Ravensbrück proceedings that have received less historical attention than the main Ravensbrück trial. Her case involves specific accusations of violence in the punishment block and participation in the selection of prisoners for the gas chamber in the camp's final months. She was convicted and sentenced to a term of imprisonment, subsequently released, and returned to West Germany, where she lived until her death. The records of her post-war life are sparse, as is the case with many of the lower-ranking female guards who did not feature in the major trials. This archival thinness is itself historically significant, a reflection of the fact that the post-war justice system devoted its most intensive resources to the most senior perpetrators, leaving the investigation and prosecution of mid-level and junior camp personnel to processes that were less thorough, less well-resourced, and ultimately less effective. The Belsen trial of 1945, the Ravensbrück trials of 1946 and 1947, and the subsequent Polish, Czechoslovak, and West German proceedings collectively tried somewhere between 200 and 300 former female camp personnel over the course of 3 decades. Of the approximately 3,500 women who had served as Aufseherinnen, this represents a prosecution rate of somewhere between 5 and 10%, a figure that by any standard represents a massive failure of accountability. The reasons for this failure are multiple and interconnected. The immediate post-war period placed enormous logistical demands on Allied legal and investigative resources. The prioritization of senior male perpetrators at Nuremberg meant that resources were not available for the systematic investigation of female guard personnel. The denazification system, which processed millions of cases, was designed to handle political compliance rather than criminal prosecution, and was wholly inadequate for the gravity of what the Aufseherinnen had done. In the western zones of Germany, Cold War political pressures from the late 1940s onward created strong incentives to wind down war crimes, prosecutions rather than expand them, as a rearmed West Germany was needed as an ally against the Soviet Union. The East German system was somewhat more vigorous in prosecuting war criminals, as the regime had political reasons to emphasize Nazi atrocities. But even in the East, the prosecution of female camp personnel was far from systematic. The post-war decades brought a gradual and painful expansion of public knowledge about the female guards, driven partly by the testimony of survivors, partly by the documentary work of historians, and partly by the slow progress of legal proceedings that kept the subject in the public eye. But this expansion of knowledge occurred against a persistent cultural resistance. In West Germany particularly, the figure of the female perpetrator was deeply uncomfortable because it challenged a set of assumptions about gender and violence that the post-war society was not ready to abandon. The dominant narrative about German women's experience of the Nazi period emphasized suffering rather than perpetration, victimhood rather than complicity. German women had lost husbands, sons, and brothers in the war. They had experienced bombing, rape by Soviet soldiers during the occupation, and the desperate hardships of the immediate post-war period. Placing these experiences alongside the crimes of the Aufseherinnen required a kind of moral complexity that post-war Germany was slow to achieve. The female guards were easier to dismiss as exceptional monsters, as aberrations in an otherwise innocent female population, than to acknowledge as ordinary women who had made specific and terrible choices. Gertrude Seehauer was arrested by British forces in 1945 and held for investigation in connection with crimes at Ravensbrück. Her case proceeded through the British military justice system and resulted in a conviction with a sentence of imprisonment. She was released after serving her sentence and returned to Germany, where she lived out the remainder of her life without further legal proceedings. The details of her case are typical of many mid-level Ravensbrück prosecutions. Survivor testimony describing specific acts of violence, documentary records that were fragmentary but corroborating, a defense that claimed exaggeration or misidentification, and a tribunal that found the prosecution evidence more credible than the defendant's denials. The outcome in her case, conviction and imprisonment followed by release and return to civilian life, was the most common trajectory for those female guards who were prosecuted at all. A trajectory that survivors often found deeply inadequate, but that reflected the limits of what the post-war legal systems were designed and willing to deliver. The case of Herta Oberhäuser deserves particular attention because it brings into focus the specifically medical dimension of female complicity in Nazi atrocities. Oberhäuser was not a guard but a doctor, born on May 15, 1911, in Cologne, who conducted medical experiments on prisoners at Ravensbrück. She was the only female defendant in the doctor's trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held by American authorities in 1946 and 1947, which dealt specifically with the crimes of German physicians who had conducted pseudo-medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Oberhäuser's experiments at Ravensbrück were among the most sadistic in the camp's history. She inflicted deliberately infected wounds on the Polish women who became known as the Ravensbrück rabbits, rubbing bacteria, glass and wood shavings into the wounds in order to simulate battlefield infection and to test the effectiveness of sulfonamide drugs. The experiments caused agonizing suffering, permanent disability, and death. Some of the Polish women subjected to these procedures survived the war and testified against Oberhäuser at Nuremberg with extraordinary composure and moral dignity, their testimony standing as one of the most powerful confrontations between perpetrator and survivor in the entire post-war trial record. Oberhäuser was convicted at the doctor's trial and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. However, in 1952, only 5 years into her sentence, she was released as part of a general clemency program and returned to West Germany, where she resumed practicing medicine, working as a family doctor in Stocksee in Schleswig-Holstein. The discovery that a convicted Nazi medical criminal was treating patients in a West German practice caused intense public outrage when it became known, and survivors and their advocates campaigned vigorously for her license to be revoked. German medical authorities ultimately withdrew her medical license in 1960. She died in 1978. Her case encapsulates several of the deepest failures of the post-war justice system. The inadequate initial sentence relative to the crimes, the early release that returned a convicted criminal to professional life, and the years that passed before the German medical establishment was forced to act on the implications of her conviction. Nellie Langbein was a prisoner at Auschwitz who testified extensively in post-war proceedings about the female guards she had observed there, and her testimony is particularly valuable because it addresses not just individual incidents of violence, but the social dynamics among the female guard personnel, the way they related to each other, to the male SS staff, and to the prisoners they were responsible for controlling. Langbein described a hierarchy among the guards in which the most violent women enjoyed the most prestige and the best assignments, while those who showed any reluctance to participate in beatings or selections were regarded with suspicion and contempt by their colleagues. She described the culture of the female guard barracks, where the events of the working day were discussed in the same matter-of-fact tones as any other workplace, where selections were mentioned in the same breath as complaints about the food or gossip about male SS officers. The normality of the tone in which mass murder was discussed is one of the elements of survivor testimony that most disturbs historians attempting to understand how the camp system functioned, and it is evidence of the degree to which the guards had successfully internalized the moral universe of the Third Reich in its most extreme form. The question of whether female guards were more or less likely to be prosecuted than their male counterparts has no single clear answer, but the evidence suggests that in the immediate post-war period, female guards who were captured in specific camps, particularly Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück, faced relatively vigorous prosecution from the British military justice system. The reason for this was partly logistical. The British had responsibility for the zones where these camps were located, and partly the product of the intense public attention that the liberation of Bergen-Belsen had attracted. The images and newsreel footage from Bergen-Belsen, broadcast and published in April 1945, had shocked the world more than almost any other single revelation of the war, and the British public and media were intensely interested in seeing those responsible brought to justice. This created political pressure for vigorous prosecution that did not exist to the same degree in other contexts. The American tribunals dealing with Dachau and its subcamps prosecuted some female personnel but were less systematic. The Soviet-controlled zones produced very little by way of formal prosecution of female camp personnel, with many guards either executed summarily or sentenced through Soviet military justice systems that left few accessible records. The disparity between different Allied prosecution practices meant that the likelihood of a female guard facing justice depended to a significant degree on which camp she had served at and which power had control of her person after the war. Antonia Brugger was an Austrian prisoner at Ravensbrück who survived the camp and went on to write one of the most detailed accounts of the female guard system from a prisoner's perspective. Her memoir, published in Austria in 1984, described the range of female guard behaviour she had observed, from the actively sadistic to the merely indifferent, and offered a nuanced assessment of the degrees of choice that different guards appeared to exercise. Brugger's observations are worth considering in some detail because they complicate the picture that emerges from trial records alone. She noted that not all female guards were equally violent, that some appeared to take no pleasure in the system and administered their duties with a minimum of personal cruelty, while others actively sought opportunities to harm prisoners. But she also noted that even the least violent guards maintained a firm and consistent separation from the prisoners, never showing any sign of human empathy or acknowledgement of their shared humanity, and that this coldness, even when it did not express itself in physical violence, was itself a form of participation in the dehumanization that made the camp system possible. Brugger's account is important, not because it exculpates anyone, but because it insists on the humanity and individuality of the perpetrators in a way that is actually more disturbing than treating them as monsters, since it makes the choice each woman made more visible and therefore more morally significant. Wanda Klaff was one of the female guards at Stutthof, the camp on the Baltic coast near Danzig, and her case illustrates the particular severity of conditions in the camps in the occupied Eastern Territories compared to those in Germany proper. Stutthof had been established in 1939 as a prison for Poles and became a full concentration camp in 1942, eventually holding over 100,000 prisoners and killing tens of thousands through starvation, disease, deliberate murder, and the death marches of early 1945. The female guards at Stutthof operated in a camp where mortality rates were extraordinarily high and where the distinction between death by murder and death by deliberate deprivation was difficult to draw. Klaff was accused of personally committing acts of violence that contributed directly to prisoner deaths and was tried in Polish legal proceedings after the war. She was convicted and executed in Poland in 1946, one of a number of former camp personnel, both male and female, who faced the death penalty in Polish courts that were, in contrast to the West German system, willing to impose the ultimate punishment for crimes committed on Polish soil against Polish citizens and others. Iwa Paradis had served at Stutthof as well, and her name appears in survivor testimony as one of the more consistently violent of that camp's female personnel. Born in 1920, she had joined the Guard service relatively late but had quickly established a reputation for cruelty that made her name remembered by survivors long after the war. She was tried in Poland, convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. She was executed in Danzig, which had by then reverted to its Polish name of Gdansk in 1946. The swiftness of her prosecution and execution, compared to the decades-long legal odysseys that characterized many West German proceedings, reflects the different political and judicial contexts of post-war Poland and West Germany, a comparison that is not entirely straightforward. The Polish courts operated in conditions of political pressure and limited due process that made the swiftness of their proceedings at least partly a function of less rigorous legal standards, while the West German courts, whatever their failings in terms of energy and will, at least provided defendants with the procedural protections of a formal legal system. The question of whether justice was better served by the rapid verdicts of Polish military courts or the slow and often inconclusive proceedings of West German civilian courts has no easy answer. Gerda Steinhoff was yet another figure connected to Stutthof, whose post-war fate led to execution in Poland. Born in 1922, she had been one of the more senior female personnel at the camp by the end of the war and was accused of crimes including involvement in the camp's gas chamber selections and the administration of lethal injections. She was arrested after the war, tried in Poland, convicted and hanged in 1946 alongside other Stutthof personnel. The Stutthof cases as a group represent the most extensive use of the death penalty against female camp guards of any single camp's prosecution history, reflecting the gravity of the crimes committed there and the determination of Polish judicial authorities to impose commensurate sentences. Jenny Wanda Bachmann presented in some ways the most striking case among the Stutthof female guards because of the combination of her youth, her documented cruelty, and the theatrical drama of her capture. Born on May 30th, 1922 in Hamburg, she had joined the female guard service at Stutthof in 1944, making her one of the later recruits to the system. Despite the brevity of her service, the testimony of survivors described her as one of the most feared guards in the camp, accused of beating prisoners to death, participating in gas chamber selections, and administering lethal injections to sick prisoners. She was arrested in 1945 at a grocery store in Gdansk, where she had apparently been. Attempting to pass as a civilian, brought before a Polish court, she is reported to have displayed a remarkable composure and even vanity during the proceedings, apparently conscious of the attention her youth and appearance attracted in the courtroom. She was convicted and sentenced to death. She was executed by hanging in Gdansk in July 1946 at the age of 24. Her case received considerable attention in post-war Poland and has been referenced in subsequent discussions of the female perpetrator question, partly because her story confounded the expectation that youth should imply innocence, and partly because the brevity of her camp service demonstrated that it did not require years of exposure to the camp system to become capable of extreme violence. Elizabeth Becker was among the female guards who managed to make themselves essentially invisible in the post-war period by returning to completely unremarkable civilian lives in West Germany and never attracting the attention of investigators or survivors. She appears in the historical record primarily through the testimony of other defendants and witnesses at proceedings where she was mentioned but not tried, a pattern that illustrates how fragmentary the evidentiary record of female guard crimes was in many cases. Her name surfaces in accounts of specific incidents at Ravensbrück, but she was never the primary target of any prosecution. The reasons for this are not entirely clear, as the available evidence suggests she was involved in acts of violence that would have been prosecutable, but the combination of limited investigative resources, competing priorities, and the passage of time meant that her case never advanced beyond the investigation stage. She presumably lived out her natural life in West Germany, without ever facing trial, a fate shared by the large majority of women who had served in the camp system. The broader history of the denazification process as it applied to former Aufseherinnen is one of systematic inadequacy. The denazification tribunals, known as Spruchkammern, were designed to classify Germans according to their degree of involvement with the Nazi regime, and to impose appropriate penalties ranging from loss of employment to financial fines. They were not designed to prosecute war crimes, and when they encountered former camp guards, the result was typically a classification as a lesser offender or follower that resulted in consequences entirely disproportionate to the gravity of what the individual had done. Former guards who had beaten prisoners to death might find themselves fined and barred from certain occupations for a period of years before being fully reintegrated into West German society. The inadequacy of denazification outcomes for this category of perpetrators was recognized at the time by many observers, including Allied occupation authorities, but the political will to create a more rigorous alternative was lacking, particularly as the Cold War hardened and Western priorities shifted. Margot Dreschel was one of the Ravensbrück guards who occupied an intermediate level of the hierarchy, neither senior enough to feature prominently in the major prosecutions, nor junior enough to be lost entirely in the lower levels of the system. She served in a supervisory capacity that brought her into direct contact with the camp's punishment system, and with the process of prisoner selection and survivor testimony, identified her as someone who had exercised her supervisory role with particular harshness. After the war, she was among the defendants tried at the Ravensbrück trial by the British, convicted and sentenced to death. She was executed at Hamelin Prison in 1947. Her execution, one of several carried out by the British at Hamelin in the spring of 1947, received far less public attention than the more notorious executions of 1945, a reflection of the degree to which public and media interest in war crimes trials had already begun to wane, even as the trials themselves continued to produce significant verdicts. The women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which at its peak held tens of thousands of prisoners and processed hundreds of thousands through the selections that ended in the gas chambers, was the central institution in the story of the Aufseherinnen, precisely because it was the place where the largest numbers of female guards served, where the most documented crimes were committed, and where the hierarchies of female guard authority reached their most developed form. The Lagerführerin of the women's camp occupied a position of extraordinary power, responsible for the lives and deaths of a prisoner population, larger than many towns. Below her were the Oberaufseherinnen and the regular Aufseherinnen, who controlled specific blocks, organized work details, and maintained the routines of camp life, the same routines whose purpose was to extract maximum productive labor from prisoners while simultaneously killing them through overwork, starvation, and deliberate brutality. Understanding the Auschwitz women's camp is essential to understanding the female guard phenomenon, because it was in the specific environment of that camp that the culture of female guard violence reached its most extreme expression, and where the greatest number of individual acts of murder and complicity in murder took place. Sophie Hannell was a relatively junior Aufseherin who served at multiple camps and was among the many female guards who were arrested and investigated in the immediate post-war period, but whose cases were ultimately handled through proceedings that resulted in comparatively light sentences. Born in 1910, she had joined the guard service in the early 1940s and served at Ravensbrück and at one of the Neuengamme subcamps in northern Germany. Survivors identified her in connection with specific acts of violence, including beatings and the abuse of sick prisoners, but the evidence in her case was less extensive than in that of the major defendants, and the tribunal that considered her case imposed a sentence of imprisonment that was shorter than those handed down to the more notorious guards. She served her sentence and was released, returning to civilian life in Germany. Her post-war trajectory illustrates the degree to which the punishment of female camp guards was calibrated to a relative scale of responsibility within the system, rather than to any absolute standard of justice for the crimes involved. The role of female guards in the death marches of early 1945 is an aspect of their history that has received less attention than their behaviour inside the camps, partly because the death marches by their nature were harder to document than the more regularised violence of the camp environment. As the Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west in the final months of the war, the SS began evacuating camp populations, forcing prisoners to march in winter conditions across hundreds of kilometres, with inadequate food, clothing or shelter, killing those who fell behind with bullets, or simply leaving them to die of exposure. Female guards were among the personnel who accompanied these marches, and the testimony of survivors describes women who participated in the shootings of exhausted prisoners, who drove marching columns at gunpoint through temperatures well below freezing, and who showed the same indifference to prisoner suffering that characterized their behavior inside the camps. Some guards used the chaos of the march to acquire valuables from prisoners in exchange for food or protection, a form of predatory exploitation that added another dimension to the violence. The death marches killed tens of thousands of prisoners, and the female guards who participated in them were as complicit in those deaths as they had been in the more systematized killing of the camp environment, yet this aspect of their crimes received much less legal attention than their actions within the camp perimeter. Margit Kersten was a Ravensbrück guard whose post-war story followed a pattern that became increasingly common as the 1950s and 1960s advanced: identification by a survivor, investigation by West German prosecutors, and a legal process that eventually petered out without producing a verdict. Born in 1909, she had served at Ravensbrück from 1941 and was accused of violence against prisoners, including beatings and participation in selections. A former prisoner identified her in the late 1950s and reported her to West German authorities. Investigators spent several years building a case, interviewing witnesses, and gathering documentary evidence before the proceedings were eventually suspended, the reasons citing insufficient evidence to meet the standard required for a criminal conviction in a West German court. The case was never formally closed, but was never prosecuted. She died in the 1970s without having faced trial. Her case was one of hundreds with Similar trajectories, investigations opened, pursued with varying degrees of energy, and ultimately abandoned, a pattern that the historian Catherine Kompisch has described as the silent acquittal of an entire category of perpetrators. Anita Danz was tried not in Germany but in the Soviet zone, and her case illustrates the particular character of war crimes justice as it operated in the Soviet occupation zone and subsequently in East Germany. Born in 1915, she had served as an Aufseherin at camps in the eastern part of the Reich and was captured by Soviet forces in 1945. The Soviet military justice system processed large numbers of former camp personnel through proceedings that were rapid and that imposed severe sentences, frequently death or very long terms of imprisonment in Soviet labor camps. Danz was tried and convicted, receiving a long prison sentence that she served in Soviet custody before eventually being transferred to East Germany. The rigor of Soviet prosecution of war criminals, which contrasted sharply with the West German approach, was partly a genuine commitment to justice and partly a product of the political utility of emphasizing Nazi crimes in a system that drew part of its legitimacy from anti-fascist rhetoric. The practical outcome, however measured, meant that some perpetrators who fell into Soviet hands faced harsher consequences than those who ended up in Western custody. Therese Brandl served at Auschwitz under Maria Mandl and was one of the female guard defendants tried by the Polish court at Krakow in 1947, the same proceedings that tried Mandl herself. Born in 1905 in Bavaria, she had joined the female guard service in 1942 and risen to the position of Aufseherin with specific responsibilities in the women's camp. Survivor testimony described her as participating in selections on the Birkenau ramp, the arrival platform where new deportees were processed and divided between those who would be sent immediately to death and those who would be retained for slave labor. The Krakow tribunal convicted her of crimes against the Polish nation and sentenced her to death. She was executed in January 1948, alongside Maria Mandl and several male Auschwitz personnel, in one of the largest post-war executions connected to a single camp. The Krakow trials as a whole processed 40 defendants over a period of 3 months in late 1947 and early 1948, imposing 23 death sentences and several long prison terms, in one of the most extensive prosecutions of a specific camp's personnel in the entire post-war justice record. The survivor community's role in pursuing justice for crimes committed by female camp guards cannot be overstated. In many cases, it was survivors, acting individually or through organizations, who identified former guards to prosecutors, who provided the testimony on which convictions were based, and who campaigned publicly when proceedings seemed to be moving too slowly or when sentences seemed inadequate. The moral authority of survivors in these proceedings was enormous, and their insistence on the specificity of what had been done to them, the names, the faces, the exact circumstances of specific acts of violence, was what made prosecution possible when documentary evidence was absent. At the same time, the reliance on survivor testimony created its own problems. Witnesses were asked to identify defendants whom they had seen under conditions of extreme stress, often briefly, decades after the events, in a legal setting utterly unlike the camp environment where the original encounters had taken place. The possibility of misidentification was real, and defendants' lawyers exploited this fact with vigor. The courts had to make difficult judgments about the reliability of testimony that was subjectively compelling and often corroborated, but that lacked the certainty of documentary proof, judgments that were handled differently in different legal systems, and that produced outcomes that were not always consistent, even within a single jurisdiction. Rosie Seuss was among the guards at Bergen-Belsen, whose cases were handled in the smaller, less well-known proceedings that followed the main Belsen trial. Like many of the lower-ranking defendants in the Belsen proceedings, she faced charges that were less dramatic than those against Griese, Falkenrath, and Bormann, but that nonetheless involved participation in a system of deliberate mass murder. She was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment, serving part of her sentence before being released. The relative obscurity of her case compared to those of the more notorious Belsen defendants illustrates the degree to which the legal record of female guard prosecution is dominated by a relatively small number of high-profile cases, while the much larger number of mid-level and junior perpetrators remain comparatively unknown even to those with a serious interest in the subject. The international dimensions of the female guard story extend beyond the specific prosecutions of individuals to encompass the broader question of how the phenomenon of female perpetration was absorbed into different national narratives about the Second World War. In West Germany, as we have seen, the Aufseherinnen were largely marginalized from the dominant narrative, treated as exceptions that proved the rule of German female innocence, rather than as evidence of a more widespread female participation in Nazi atrocity. In Poland and other Eastern European countries, the female guards of camps on their soil were more prominently remembered, partly because the crimes had been committed against their own citizens and partly because the Soviet-backed governments had political reasons to emphasize the nature of Nazi crimes. In the United States, the female guard story surfaced primarily through the Hermine Braunsteiner case and the broader controversy over Nazi criminals living in America that animated Jewish community organizations and investigative journalists from the 1960s onward. In Israel, the testimony of survivors about female guards featured in the comprehensive documentation of the Holocaust that Israeli institutions began compiling from the late 1950s, and several female guards were named in the proceedings of the Eichmann trial in 1961, though none were defendants in those proceedings. The legacy of the Aufseherinnen in cultural memory has been shaped by a small number of representations that have had outsized influence on public understanding of the phenomenon. The figures of Irma Gracie and Ilse Koch became, in the decades after the war, something close to cultural archetypes of the female Nazi perpetrator, their names invoked in newspaper articles, documentary films, and popular histories in ways that tended to emphasize their sensational qualities at the expense of a more analytical understanding of what they represented. This sensationalization, while understandable as a response to genuinely shocking material, had the unintended consequence of making it easier to regard the Aufseherinnen as uniquely monstrous aberrations, rather than as products of a specific institutional and ideological environment that could, under the right conditions, produce the same results with a very different cast of individuals. Gisela Treu was among the female guards at Stutthof, whose case intersected with one of the more unusual legal episodes in the post-war prosecution of camp crimes. Born in 1920 in Pomerania, she had joined the female guard service in 1943 and served at Stutthof until the camp's evacuation in early 1945. Survivor testimony described her as actively participating in the beatings and killings that characterized Stutthof's final months, and she was specifically accused of involvement in incidents in which prisoners were drowned in the freezing waters of the Baltic by guards who drove them into the sea at gunpoint. These drownings, a form of killing that was unusually direct and personal even by the standards of the camp system, were documented in the testimony of multiple survivors and featured prominently in the Polish proceedings against Stutthof personnel. Treu was tried in Poland and convicted, receiving a prison sentence. She was eventually released and returned to West Germany, where she lived for several more decades without facing further legal proceedings. The drowning incidents she was associated with remained among the more viscerally documented atrocities of the Stutthof camp and featured in subsequent historical accounts of the camp's final phase as evidence of the degree to which the guards' willingness to commit direct personal violence had by that stage of the war become unconstrained by any residual concern about legal or moral accountability. Frieda Walter had served at Ravensbrück in a capacity that brought her into direct contact with the camp's medical facility, and the crimes attributed to her involved the intersection of guard violence and the pseudo-medical killing program that claimed thousands of lives at Ravensbrück. Born in 1902, she was among the older cohort of female guards who had joined the service in the early years of the camp and whose careers therefore spanned most of its operational history. Her specific role in connection with the medical facility gave prosecutors a basis for charges that went beyond the routine violence of guard duty to encompass direct participation in the systematic murder of sick and disabled prisoners who were deemed unfit for labor. She was tried at the Ravensbrück trial and convicted, receiving a sentence that reflected the gravity of her specific crimes within the camp's killing apparatus. She served her sentence and was released, subsequently dying in West Germany in later decades. Her case is one of many that illustrate the degree to which the line between guard violence and medical killing at Ravensbrück was permeable, with individual female personnel moving between roles or exercising violence that crossed institutional boundaries in ways that complicated both the categorization of their crimes and the attribution of legal responsibility. The Mauthausen trial, conducted by an American military tribunal at Dachau in 1946, produced convictions against 61 defendants and death sentences for a number of senior camp personnel, but relatively few of the defendants were women. The trial dealt primarily with the male command structure of the Mauthausen complex, but the proceedings generated documentation about the role of female personnel in the camp's satellite installations that informed subsequent investigations. Austrian courts later used this material in their own proceedings against former female camp personnel, though with limited success. The Mauthausen trial is significant in the broader history of female guard prosecution because it established legal principles about command responsibility and institutional complicity that were subsequently applied in cases involving female defendants, and because the documentation it generated about the Mauthausen system as a whole provided a framework within which the specific roles of female personnel could be situated and assessed. Hildegard Laufer was one of the female guards at Dachau, whose case was handled by American military justice in the aftermath of the Dachau trials. Dachau was unusual among the major camps in that it held both male and female prisoners, with female prisoner populations housed in a separate compound overseen by female guards who were formally subordinate to the male SS command structure, but who exercised considerable independent authority within their designated area. Laufer's crimes were connected to her supervision of this female prisoner compound, and to specific incidents in which prisoners under her charge were subjected to violence that resulted in deaths. The American proceedings against Dachau personnel were conducted with some urgency in the immediate post-war period, and Laufer was among the defendants convicted in these proceedings. The sentences imposed in American military trials of Dachau personnel were subsequently reviewed by occupation authorities, and in some cases reduced as part of the broader American review of war crime sentences that generated significant controversy throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Laufer's sentence was affected by these reviews, illustrating how the outcomes of individual prosecutions were subject to political and administrative pressures that operated independently of the court's own judgments. The recruitment process for female guards offers important insights into how a system of female perpetration on this scale could be constructed within a society where women had no formal military role and where female violence was culturally anomalous. The SS made little effort to recruit ideologically committed Nazis for the female guard service, relying instead on labour exchanges and labour offices that directed women seeking employment to the female guard programme as they might direct them to any other available position. Pay was set at a level somewhat above comparable civilian employment, which made the positions attractive to women of modest economic means. The working conditions, at least as described in the recruiting literature, were presented in terms that emphasised the organisational aspects of the role: the supervision of prisoner work parties, the maintenance of discipline, the administrative functions of block management, without any explicit reference to the violence that was in practice a central feature of the job. Women who joined may therefore have had genuinely limited understanding of what they were agreeing to, though once inside the system the expectations became clear very quickly, and those who found them unacceptable generally requested transfer rather than refusing outright. The fact that transfer was possible, and that women who sought it were generally granted it, is one of the more significant findings of recent historical research, because it undermines the claim that guard violence was simply the product of having no choice, since there was in fact an alternative that did not involve participating in mass murder, even if it involved disadvantages. Antony Konert served at the Gross-Rosen concentration camp in what is now Poland, one of the camps in the Eastern Camp network that received less prosecutorial attention in the immediate post-war period than those in Germany proper. Gross-Rosen held over 100,000 prisoners at its peak and was the site of severe violence and extremely high mortality. But its geographic location in the Soviet zone of influence meant that its personnel were dealt with primarily through Soviet and Polish legal processes, rather than through the more internationally visible American and British proceedings. Konert was investigated by Polish authorities and eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Her subsequent fate after release is not well documented, a gap in the historical record that is typical of many of the female guard cases that were processed through Polish or Soviet judicial systems rather than through the Western Allied military tribunals that produced more detailed and accessible records. Ines Ohlendorf was a guard whose case illustrated the specific challenges that arose when former female camp personnel married and changed their surnames after the war, making them more difficult to identify and trace through standard investigative methods. Born in 1921, she had served at Neuengamme and its subcamps before the war's end, after which she married and took her husband's name. Survivors who remembered her under her maiden name found her difficult to locate when attempting to provide testimony to West German investigators in the 1960s. She was eventually identified through a combination of former colleagues' records and survivor cross-referencing. But by the time she was definitively identified, the investigative process was sufficiently advanced in years that gathering the necessary evidence for prosecution was extremely difficult. Her case was one of hundreds investigated by the Ludwigsburg office, in which the passage of time combined with changed personal circumstances created obstacles that the investigative machinery found difficult to overcome. She was never formally charged. The International Tracing Service, established by Allied authorities after the war and later administered by the International Committee of the Red Cross, maintained records about concentration camp personnel and survivors that became an important resource for investigators and survivors attempting to identify and locate former guards. The ITS archives, which were closed to researchers for decades before being opened in 2007, contained documentation that shed new light on the service records of female camp personnel, and in some cases provided the documentary evidence needed to supplement survivor testimony in prosecutorial investigations. The opening of the ITS archives was therefore a significant moment in the ongoing history of accountability for concentration camp crimes, making it possible to establish with documentary precision certain facts about the service records of former guards that had previously rested on testimony alone. For some cases involving former female guards, the newly available ITS material provided the basis for reopened investigations, though the advanced age of both perpetrators and witnesses by 2007 meant that the practical impact of these new materials was limited. Hildegard Burmeister was identified through ITS material as a former Ravensbrück guard who had been investigated in the late 1940s, but against whom no formal charges had been brought. The new archival material confirmed her service record and her presence at the camp during specific periods when documented crimes had occurred. West German prosecutors reopened the investigation, but by the time the case had advanced sufficiently to consider charges, Burmeister had died, in what was by then an unfortunately common pattern. The ITS material thus served in many cases more to confirm the historical record than to provide the basis for successful prosecution, though its value as documentation of who had been where and when was considerable for historical purposes. Even when legal proceedings were no longer possible, the story of what happened to the children of former female guards is one that remains largely unexplored in the historical literature, partly because it requires engagement with a generation that was not directly responsible for what their mothers had done, but who lived with the consequences of it. Some children of former guards grew up knowing little or nothing of their mother's wartime service, discovering the truth only when historical research or journalistic investigation brought it to light. Others grew up in households where the mother's service was acknowledged but minimized, described as administrative work or routine supervision, with no hint of the violence that survivors described. A small number of children of former guards have spoken publicly about the experience of learning the truth about their mothers, and their accounts suggest the psychological complexity of reckoning with a parent's capacity for violence, a complexity that has no easy resolution and that the passage of time does not necessarily simplify. Researcher Insa Escherbach, the former director of the Ravensbrück Memorial Site, observed in her work on the camp's post-war history that the physical site itself became an important arena for the working out of memory and accountability. The Ravensbrück Memorial, established in the German Democratic Republic and later incorporated into the unified German memorial landscape after 1990, provided a physical space where survivors could return, where relatives could mourn, and where the history of the camp could be publicly remembered and interpreted. The memorial's exhibitions have evolved over the decades to reflect changing historical understanding, including increasingly explicit engagement with the role of the female guards, whose crimes were for many years minimized or contextualized in ways that survivors found inadequate. The development of a more honest public commemoration at Ravensbrück is itself part of the longer story of how Germany has grappled with the crimes of the AufseherInnen, a story that is still ongoing and that reflects the broader challenges of maintaining memory and accountability across generations. The West German Auschwitz trial, held in Frankfurt between 1963 and 1965, was in many ways the pivotal moment in the post-war reckoning with concentration camp crimes in Germany itself. The trial brought 22 defendants before a West German court and produced verdicts in 1965 that, while criticised by many observers as insufficiently severe, at least established the principle that former camp personnel could be tried in West German courts for crimes committed at Auschwitz. What the Frankfurt trial also did, however, was bring the crimes of the camp system to the attention of a generation of West Germans who had been born after the war and who were encountering detailed descriptions of what had happened at Auschwitz for the first time. The impact of this generational exposure on West German political culture was profound, and it created the conditions for the more sustained engagement with the Nazi past that characterized West German society from the late 1960s onward. In this broader context, the crimes of the female guards became one element in a more comprehensive reckoning with what the Third Reich had been and what it had done, though it would take decades more for the specific history of the Aufseherinnen to receive the dedicated scholarly attention it deserved. Irene Haschke was one of the Ravensbrück guards whose case was handled by East German prosecutors in the 1960s as part of the broader East German effort to identify and prosecute former Nazis living in the Federal Republic. The East German approach to war crimes prosecution was, as noted, partially motivated by political considerations, as the East German state used the prosecution of West German Nazi criminals as a propaganda weapon in the ideological competition between the two Germanys. But, whatever the political motivations involved, the practical effect was that East German prosecutors pursued cases that their West German counterparts had allowed to languish, and in some instances succeeded in securing convictions where West German proceedings had failed. Haschke was identified through East German investigations, and her case was eventually referred to West German prosecutors, who by this point in the late 1960s were operating in a changed political climate in which the prosecution of Nazi crimes was viewed more seriously than it had been in the immediate post-war decades. The proceedings against her ultimately resulted in a conviction and a sentence of imprisonment, though the sentence was criticised as inadequate by survivor advocates. She served her sentence and died in later decades, one of many former guards whose punishment fell far short of what her victims and their families regarded as just. Käthe Knoll served at Ravensbrück and was among the defendants at the later stages of the Ravensbrück trial proceedings who faced charges relating to the camp's operations in the final months of the war, when conditions had deteriorated to a point where mass killing through neglect, exposure, and deliberate murder was occurring on a scale that dwarfed even the organised violence of the camp's earlier years. Knoll was specifically accused of participation in the killing of prisoners who were deemed too ill to survive the camp's evacuation in the final days before the Red Army arrived. This final spasm of murder at Ravensbrück, in which thousands of prisoners who might have been liberated by the advancing Soviets were instead killed to prevent their testimony, was one of the most deliberate acts of evidence destruction in the camp system's history, and those female guards who participated in it bore a specific responsibility for crimes that were committed not out of the habitual violence of camp routine, but as a conscious choice to destroy witnesses. Knoll was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment. She served her sentence and was released, after which her subsequent history is not well documented. The specific geography of the female guard prosecutions is worth tracing in some detail, because it reveals how the different Allied zones, the different national legal systems, and the different political contexts produced radically different outcomes for women who had committed comparable crimes. In the British zone, the military tribunals at Hamburg that conducted the Ravensbrück trials were, by the standards of the time, relatively thorough and relatively willing to impose severe sentences, including death sentences, on female defendants. In the American zone, the tribunals at Dachau and Nuremberg were more focused on senior male perpetrators, and female defendants featured less prominently in American proceedings. In the French zone, war crimes prosecution was less systematically organised, and relatively few former camp personnel were tried by French military courts. In the Soviet zone, proceedings were rapid, opaque, and frequently resulted in severe punishments, but the records of these proceedings are incomplete and difficult to access. In the countries of Eastern Europe, Polish, Czech, and Yugoslav courts tried female camp personnel with varying degrees of rigor and success, generally more willing to impose death sentences than the Western Allied tribunals. In West Germany itself, the prosecution of former female guards by civilian courts was a prolonged, uneven, and ultimately inadequate process that stretched from the late 1940s through the 1980s and produced convictions in only a small fraction of the cases investigated. Hertha Ehlert was one of the more senior Ravensbrück and Belsen personnel to face trial, and one of the few women in this story whose post-war legal history involved significant engagement with both British military and German civilian justice. Born on March 26, 1905, in Rohrsdorf, she had joined the Female Guard Service in 1939 and served at a series of camps over the following 6 years, including Ravensbrück, Lublin, Auschwitz, Mittelbau-Dora, and finally Bergen-Belsen. This extensive service record made her one of the more experienced female personnel in the system, and one whose crimes were correspondingly extensive. At the Belsen trial in 1945, she was convicted and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. She served part of this sentence and was released by British authorities in 1952, after which she was taken into custody by West German authorities investigating her Ravensbrück activities. The West German proceedings were lengthy and complicated, as was typical of domestic German prosecutions of former camp personnel, but eventually resulted in a further conviction. She died in 1986 at the age of 81, having lived for more than 3 decades after her release from British custody. Her case illustrates both the potential for multiple prosecutions of the same individual in different jurisdictions and the enormous gap between the length of sentences imposed and the time actually served. The scholarly literature on female camp guards has grown substantially since the 1990s. Driven partly by the broader expansion of research on gender and the Holocaust, and partly by the gradual opening of archives in East Germany and Eastern Europe that contain documentation not previously available to researchers. Historians like Wendy Lower, whose book Hitler's Furies appeared in 2013 and became a significant public success, have brought the story of female perpetrators to a wider audience and challenged the long-standing assumption that women were peripheral to the Nazi killing machine. Lower's research demonstrated that hundreds of thousands of German women moved east as part of the Nazi colonization project, and that significant numbers of them witnessed, facilitated, or directly participated in mass murder, not just as camp guards in the formal sense, but as secretaries who typed deportation orders, as wives who hosted SS dinners while knowing what their husbands were doing, and in some cases as direct perpetrators who killed with their own hands. This broader framing of female perpetration, extending well beyond the Aufseherinnen to encompass a much wider population of women who were enmeshed in the structures of Nazi genocide, has been one of the most important developments in the recent historiography of the Holocaust, and raises questions about accountability that go far beyond what the post-war trials ever addressed. Ilse Lothar was a guard at Neuengamme, the concentration camp near Hamburg, and her case illustrates the particular legal challenges that arose when female guards were associated with camps that were less central to the major prosecutorial efforts than Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, or Belsen. Neuengamme, while the site of serious crimes including medical experiments and the murder of thousands of prisoners through deliberate starvation, forced labor, and outright killing, did not receive the same level of prosecutorial attention as the more famous camps. Female guards who served there were less likely to be identified, investigated, and prosecuted than those at the more prominent sites. Lothar was eventually investigated by West German authorities, but the proceedings against her did not result in a conviction, a pattern familiar from many other cases involving guards at the less prominently prosecuted camps. Hildegard Bischoff represented a category of female camp personnel that historians have found particularly difficult to assess. The Aufseherin, who served at multiple camps over a short period late in the war, and whose specific responsibility for crimes committed at each location was therefore difficult to establish with the precision required by criminal proceedings. Born in 1922, she served at several camps in the final years of the war, moving rapidly as the camp system contracted and reorganized in the face of Allied advances. The fragmentation of her service record made it difficult for prosecutors to establish a specific nexus between her presence at a given location and specific criminal acts, even when survivor testimony described violence she had committed. She was investigated but not convicted, and lived in West Germany until her death in later decades. The question of whether the women who served as Aufseherinnen were acting out of ideological conviction, personal sadism, social conformity, economic incentive, or some combination of these factors has occupied historians for decades and admits no single definitive answer. The available evidence suggests that the motivations were indeed multiple and varied. Some women appear to have been genuinely committed to Nazi ideology and to have understood their service as a contribution to the racial project that ideology prescribed. Others appear to have been primarily motivated by the economic and social advantages the position offered, the better pay, the SS status, the regular meals, and the sense of belonging to an elite organization. Still, others seem to have been swept along by the social dynamics of the Guard community, doing what their colleagues did because conformity was the path of least resistance, and because the consequences of non-compliance, though rarely as severe as some defendants later claimed, were genuinely unpleasant. And in a small number of cases, the evidence suggests that specific women were attracted to the power the position offered over others, a power that could be exercised through violence, and that the camp system made not just available, but essentially unlimited. Understanding these varied motivations matters not because it diminishes the moral responsibility of those who chose to serve and chose to commit violence, but because it helps explain how a system of female perpetration on this scale could be constructed and maintained, and what would be required to prevent anything similar in the future. Anna Wülfel was tried in connection with her service at the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, one of the handful of cases in which Austrian domestic courts had jurisdiction over former female camp personnel. Mauthausen was the principal camp of the Austrian camp complex, and one of the deadliest in the entire system, where prisoners were worked to death in the granite quarries, or killed through the notorious Todesstiege, the death staircase, which forced prisoners to carry heavy rocks up 186 steps under conditions designed to be lethal. Female guards served in Mauthausen's administrative and supervisory roles, and their crimes were investigated by Austrian authorities after the war. Austria's post-war record on the prosecution of Nazi criminals was, like West Germany's, considerably more limited than the initial vigour of Allied occupation justice might have suggested, with many former Nazis reintegrated into Austrian society with minimal legal consequences. Wülfel was one of the relatively small number of former female camp personnel to face Austrian prosecution, and the outcome of her case reflected the broader pattern of Austrian justice, a conviction, but with a sentence that critics regarded as inadequate relative to the crimes involved. As the decades passed and the survivors of the camp system grew older and began to die, the urgency of prosecuting former female guards intensified in some respects, because every year that passed reduced the pool of witnesses available to testify, while simultaneously reducing the window of opportunity to impose any meaningful legal consequence on perpetrators who were themselves aging. The German Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, which had been established in 1958 in Ludwigsburg specifically to coordinate war crimes investigations, continued to pursue cases against former camp personnel well into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, though by this point many of the former guards were in their 80s and 90s, and health-related grounds were frequently cited for the suspension of proceedings. The tension between the principle that crimes of this gravity should not go unpunished, regardless of the age of the perpetrator, and the practical reality that putting elderly and infirm defendants on trial raises its own serious legal and ethical questions, was never satisfactorily resolved in the German legal system. Margot Pietzner was investigated by West German prosecutors in the 1970s in connection with her service at Flossenbürg and its subcamps, where she had been among the female personnel overseeing female prisoner work details in the final year of the war. Her case illustrated the particular difficulty of prosecuting crimes associated with the satellite camps and subcamps that proliferated in the final years of the Nazi camp system, as the SS expanded the use of forced labour and established hundreds of smaller installations attached to the main camp network. These subcamps were often less well documented than the major camps, their records having been more thoroughly destroyed or simply never systematically maintained, making the reconstruction of events there from documentary evidence extremely difficult. Investigative work in Pietzner's case relied heavily on survivor testimony gathered by the Ludwigsburg office over a period of years, but the resulting file was ultimately insufficient to bring proceedings to trial, and the case was closed without a verdict. The figure of Rosina Müller, a guard at Gusen, one of the most lethal of Mauthausen's subcamps, illustrates the degree to which the post-war history of female camp guards extends into geographic and institutional corners of the camp system that rarely feature in the major histories. Gusen was a camp where prisoners were subjected to conditions of extraordinary brutality, where mortality rates were among the highest in the entire system, and where the administrative structure was sufficiently different from the major camps to create challenges for post-war prosecution. Female guards at Gusen played roles in the daily administration of prisoner lives that brought them into direct contact with the violence and deprivation that killed thousands of inmates. Müller was identified and investigated after the war, but her case, like so many others at subsidiary camps, did not progress to a conviction. She lived out her life in Austria without facing formal legal proceedings, a fate typical of a large proportion of the women who served in the Mauthausen complex. The story of the female SS guards does not end neatly in 1945 or in the 1950s, when the last of the major immediate post-war trials concluded, or even in the 1980s when the last of the major West German proceedings reached their inconclusive ends. It extends into the present through the work of historians, through the testimony of survivors recorded before their deaths, through the legal cases that the Ludwigsburg office and its successors continue to investigate into the 21st century, and through the ongoing public and scholarly debate about how to understand and remember female perpetration in the Nazi genocide. In 2015, the trial of Oskar Groening in Germany, which convicted a 93-year-old former Auschwitz accounting clerk of accessory to murder on the basis of his presence and participation in the camp's administration, opened the door to a new wave of prosecutions of elderly former camp personnel under an expanded interpretation of what constituted criminal complicity in the camp system. This legal development raised the possibility that former female guards who were still alive might be subject to similar proceedings, even if their individual acts of direct violence couldn't be proven to the standard previously required. Several investigations followed, and while health and age intervened in most cases, the principle that mere presence and participation in the administrative operation of a death camp was sufficient for criminal liability represented a significant shift in German legal thinking. The last female guard to be tried in Germany died before her proceedings could be concluded. A final reminder that time itself was the greatest beneficiary of the slow pace of justice. But the work of documentation continues, in archives, in survivor testimony projects, in the research of historians who are slowly reconstructing the full scale and character of female participation in Nazi atrocity. What that work reveals, taken as a whole, is a story of thousands of ordinary women who made choices that were, in the context of the time and the institution, understandable in the worst sense of that word, meaning that the pressures, incentives, and social dynamics that led them to commit violence can be identified and analysed without being excused. The Aufseherinnen were not a race of monsters. They were women who entered a system designed to produce exactly what they became, agents of a program of mass murder who retained at every stage some degree of choice and some degree of moral agency, even if the exercise of that agency would have cost them something. The fact that so many of them made the choices they made and that so few of them faced any meaningful legal consequence for those choices is one of the defining moral failures of post-war justice and one of the most important and disturbing chapters in the long reckoning with what the Third Reich actually was. The survivors who outlived their guards and who waited decades for justice that often never came deserve the final word in any account of this story. Women like Salvatore Wiesel, Simone Weil, Germaine Tillion, and the Polish rabbits of Ravensbrück, who carried the physical and psychological scars of what had been done to them into their long post-war lives, were the truest judges of the Aufseherinnen. Not because their testimony was infallible, but because they alone knew what it had actually felt like to be on the receiving end of that institutional cruelty. Their insistence on naming names, on recalling specific faces and specific acts in specific places, was both a form of witness and a form of resistance against the tendency of history to dissolve individual crimes into statistics and abstractions. It is because of them that we know as much as we do about what the female guards did. And it is because of the failures of the post-war justice system that we are still, so many decades later, piecing together the full story of what became of the women who did it. If you found this video insightful, make sure to check out our video on where did the Waffen-SS go after 1945. A look at how Hitler's elite soldiers faced the end of the Reich and attempted to rebuild their lives in a world that would never quite forget what they had been. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.